by inverting the power structures that we see in society today. And on the other side, you've had the kind of dystopian view of the internet as a driver of the exact opposite of polarization, of mistrust and distrust, and the kind of creation of a kind of big brother society where all of our data is used and monitored. And I'm keen today that we kind of eschew both of those stories as overly simplistic and work out where each of those stories has elements of truth. Because both of them contain elements of truth and of over-exaggeration. And so what we want to do, I think, as a society is to harness the good things in the internet and in digital technology, but manage those aspects that are more challenging. And that is what we are here today to debate. We've got an amazing panel who are going to kick off the conversation. So in a second, I will come to Chi Onwurah MP, who is Shadow Minister for Science, Research and Digital. Welcome, Chi. We have Jessica Cecil with us. Welcome, Jessica. And Jessica is the founder of the Trusted News Initiative, and I will allow you to explain exactly what that is, but we're really privileged to have Jessica here today, who's come specially for this event and to talk to you. And we have Hugh Millward, who's General Manager, Corporate, External and Legal Affairs at Microsoft, who are very generously supporting this event and allowing us to have this conversation, which is fantastic. So thank you, Hugh. So I'm going to kick off, and I'm going to hand over to Chi to open the conversation. Over to you, Chi.
Thank you very much, Harry, and thanks very much to IPPR and Microsoft for enabling this conversation. This discussion is a very important discussion. And I do want to start off by saying that I am a tech evangelist. Right? I'm a chartered engineer, and my background, I spent 20 years in technology before coming into Parliament as an engineer and as in the private sector and the public sector. I believe that technology and politics are the twin engines of progress. So technology and democracy, if you like, are the twin engines of progress for humanity. But I am very, very clear as to which should lead and which should follow. And I'd also say that technology is not something that happens and shouldn't be something that happens to us. It is something that we shape, and how we shape that should be driven by our democratic values and our democratic accountability. And the challenge is the online platforms such as Facebook, Google, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, other platforms are available, but not that many of them because there isn't that much competition. But they are now a central part of all our lives, and they play an absolutely vital role in how we, for example, how we do almost everything, but how we access news and information, how and what we spend our money on, how we contribute to, how and who actually contributes to public debate, and how we utilize our spare time. But we have little to no control on how that content is curated by the tech platforms and delivered to us. And so why, hasn't there been any regulation of online content for so long? It's in the 11 years since I entered Parliament, we have had no regulation. As our lives have been transformed by digital, there has been no legislation brought forward whilst it's self-evident that self-registration has failed. Most online fake news is perfectly legal, but it can cause immense harm, and some of it has caused immense harm. Lives have been lost through COVID misinformation, for example, and it's particularly a phenomenon, if you like, of the digital age because of the way in which digital technology amplifies and industrializes lies, and then their impact on public health in the democratic process. So I think merely asking right now, is it legal for platforms to promote and spread misinformation isn't enough. The question should be asked, it should be how and should it and how does it need to be regulated? And as things stand, social media platforms are giving a huge amount of latitude. And there is a particular incentive for social media companies to actually promote misinformation. arguments with Facebook about this, but there is, due to the sheer number of clicks that fake news stories generate, and the social media content that is driven by algorithms that target specific audiences for specific content and then drive those targets to more and more extreme content, which causes more, which engenders more and more engagement. And lawmakers and regulators do not know, what we don't have any visibility of these algorithms, how they may be programmed, what their biases are. All algorithms are designed by people who have bias, trained by people with bias, so they have bias. And that is a huge concern. So I'm glad to see, if you like, that public opinion is hardening around a greater role for government. I think the kind of the no intervention argument has been lost. But we have had 10 wasted years under successive Tory governments, and we must hold them to account for that. They have presided over the internet as the Wild West web. And it has had a huge impact. Research by Derby University has shown that distrust of news sources across the board has risen. Distrust of government has risen, and maybe other reasons for that as well. But without the ability to authenticate online content, the democratic process and the relationship between the state and citizen are threatened. So the online harms bill, online safety bill, which is in draft form before going through Parliament now, has an exemption for news publishers, but only recognised news publishers will benefit from protection. I mean, the online safety bill has many issues with it, which we'll come to, but there are specific ones with regards to sort of safeguarding our democracy. And but the most important one for me is that it entrenches the platforms as the arbiters of this. And I think that outsourcing critical decisions to the platforms is just basically wrong. We need to determine, decide our values and our principles as a country and apply them. And it's also particularly wrong because there is a sort of Silicon Valley libertarianism which believes that, to your opening points, Harry, that kind of if you have, which I characterize as who needs government if you've got quad processors and Bitcoin. There's this idea that replaces democracy, if you like, and that is for many reasons fundamentally wrong, and we need to ensure that the fantastic and enabling and potentially empowering technology from which we're all benefiting is shaped by our democratic values. It has so much to offer us. We've seen that through COVID. The fact that we could continue to do large parts of our lives online, but it also has dangers, and we must recognise that, and we must bring forward forward-looking legislation which helps to address it, so that we're all safe and all our potential is realised.
Thanks, G, and we couldn't agree more with you. One of the kind of key arguments that we've made at IPPR around technology is the argument that technology is not destiny. We can determine where technology goes, yeah. And democratic society should be the way that we do that. So we welcome those comments. I should have said at the start, by the way, Kat Smith is unfortunately not very well, so she won't be joining us, but we've got Chi, so we're very happy about that. Jessica, over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Thank you to the IPPR and thank you, Microsoft. And actually, I'd like to pick up lots of the themes that Chi's outlined. I'm going to concentrate on practical suggestions for fighting disinformation, particularly to protect democracy, but outside legislation, because clearly that's its own thing. So over the last year, we've seen the real-world harm of disinformation. She's talked about it with COVID, it's cost lives, it's undermined democracy, and we've got a situation in the US at the moment where a third of adults think Joe Biden is in the White House because of fraudulent votes. That is an extraordinary situation, and disinformation has got a really, really important part to play in that. But as a result, I think it's important to notice that we are in a moment where the conversation between the tech companies and the news media about what to do about that most harmful disinformation has been turbocharged. there's now a clear recognition that the two sides, tech companies and the responsible public service media, need each other. Tech companies obviously need responsible media to get to the truth and to sort fact from fiction, and the media need the tech companies to build reach. So I think the question for all of us is, how do we make the most of what is an absolutely unique moment, but also a burning platform? We've heard about legislation and the online safety bill. I'm not going to talk about that, but I think that it's important to realise that whatever the UK decides, it's sending a really powerful international signal. Because around the world, regimes are looking really cynically to use the banner of fighting disinformation as an excuse to inhibit free speech online, from Russia, from Hungary, from Philippines, and all over the place. And I think the UK needs to show that we can get it right. We can show where disinformation can be tackled, but consistent with free speech. However, legislation is crucial, but it's not enough. Why? It's by its very nature has got to be backward-looking and reacting to problems that have happened and can reasonably be foreseen when that legislation is actually framed. But social media is evolving at extraordinary speed. So who thought, for instance, that political disinformation would be spread through audio messaging as it is at the moment in Ethiopia? Regulation can also only obviously be country by country or region by region, and it's hard to see China or Russia adopting the same regulatory framework as the UK or the EU. So I think it's useful to say what more can be done, and for me, the answer lies in much more ambitious global cooperation. I want to talk a little bit about my experience. 2 years ago at the BBC, which I recently left, I put together a global coalition of the biggest Western tech companies, including Microsoft, Google, Facebook, Twitter, alongside the world's major independent news organisations, the BBC, AFP, Reuters, AP, the FT, the Hindu, and others. And the result was something called the Trusted News Initiative, the TNI. And the focus was on really practical ways to choke off the most harmful disinformation and to do it fast. It's actually still the only international alliance reacting to disinformation in real time, i.e. in a matter of minutes and hours, not weeks and months. At its core, it is a tightly defined and agreed statement of what constitutes the most harmful disinformation, and we agreed to act on occasions where there's an immediate threat to life anywhere in the world, and also where, secondly, where there is an immediate threat to the integrity of the democratic process. It's deliberately high bar and intended to be used only rarely. Next to that, all participants signed up to a clear set of expectations and how to act. Members informed each other when they came across that extreme disinformation, and when informed, they decided what to do about it fast. And cases raised were really varied and actually unforeseen. So they ranged from political disinformation to specific death threats against journalists. And I think this points to a model that we can all build on, the potential for a second powerful weapon for combating disinformation alongside the entirely necessary legislation that is coming everywhere. It's got certain core characteristics. First, it's tightly defined what harm looks like, and that gets international buy-in. But secondly, it tightly defines what cooperation and action looks like. And to be honest, without that really core specificity, the TNI would never have got off the ground. And thirdly, there's an ability to assess and adapt as new types of cases come up. This can be agile, real-time, and can work across companies and across countries. And I'm convinced it is the germ of the idea of the way forward. So what are the broad ideas of opportunity in global alliances? I've got 5 suggestions, very briefly. First of all, I think we can carefully define disinformation in more areas than immediate threat to life, an immediate threat to the integrity of the democratic process, but where its effects are just as pernicious. brokering agreement on where free speech ends on, for instance, climate change and where immediate danger starts is really difficult but really important. Secondly, the scope to bring many more media players into the dialogue, especially the public interest media who are under siege all over the world, and this is really, really important. Just look at Eastern Europe at the moment. Supporting democracy means bringing public interest media into a common conversation about standards and with the tech companies. Thirdly, might there be a potential future body that can turn progress and these conversations into agreed standards, informed, for instance, by the most harmful disinformation as it occurs. Fourthly, we need to have an international conversation around monetary incentives for disinformation and what to do about it. At the moment, it costs absolutely nothing to put out disinformation which could turn markets. You can obviously make a lot of money, and actually there appears to be no downside. This is something that is coming and coming fast. And fifth, I think a slick system of dealing with something called imposter content. Imposter content is when a bad actor puts a fake post online but masks it to look like it's been posted by a trusted news organisation in order to gain credibility and gain virality. So it might be branded, for instance, The Guardian or the BBC or the New York Times. It risks trashing the trust in that established news brand that has been carefully built up over decades and massively amplifying misleading content. So let me give you a really specific example. When, for instance, the Prime Minister was in intensive care last year, there was a fake BBC breaking tweet saying he was dead. It was picked up fast. Luckily, it was reported into the Trusted News Initiative, but because Twitter is a partner, it was down within an hour. But other partners in the tech companies knew to look out for it. But even in that period, it was picked up by one other organisation, a TV station in Pakistan. And why wouldn't you? They thought it came from the BBC, it was an excellent source, and sadly, it was an entirely believable story. Now, what if? That could have moved markets, it could have caused panic. This is really serious, and we need frameworks for dealing with this. So, in this area, I think one other thing, emerging technology can also be our ally. For instance, Microsoft, the BBC, and others have created a technology that can detect whether a piece of media has been tampered with to create a so-called deep fake. It's really important stuff, but the success of this depends on being widely adopted internationally and becoming a universal standard. So those are some thoughts on where you can actually build bridges, but you really need to get down into the specificity of each of them. I just want to say one other thing, though, which is that it's also about personal responsibility for every single one of us. Disinformation and misinformation is radioactive. Play with facts loosely for immediate advantage, and things can get out of hand really quickly. So did President Macron know what he was unleashing in January this year when he said the AstraZeneca jab was quasi-ineffective for the over 65s? And remember, he said this on the eve of the EU medicine regulator approving AstraZeneca for all adults. Just a month later, he had to reverse his position, saying he would take the AstraZeneca jab himself. Why? 3/4 of France's AstraZeneca jabs were left unused at the same time as French COVID cases and deaths soared. We could talk about, I'm very happy to talk about media education. I think the only thing I would want to say about it is it's really, really important, but it's complicated. There are loads of initiatives out there to build critical thinking, but many of them are overlapping, and there's no route to know what to use when. There isn't a body of shared understanding of who is susceptible, what works, and how that differs from country to country. Now, the tech companies are doing a lot of work on signals and how users react to different signals on their platforms that posts are false, and I would urge them to encourage them to share their work much more widely. So I think this is a good moment to make bold proposals, and everybody's listening. But it's also a dangerous moment Disinformation threatens to wreck democracy all over the world, and each of us needs to think about making sure we're on the right side of this debate.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and it's amazing to hear about so much of the work that you've been living and breathing for so long. We couldn't have got a better expert to tell us about some of these issues, so thank you. Hugh, over to you.
Thank you. So I'm going to make a couple of points. Democracy is, I think, under attack, and it's under attack from three. Well, I'm going to talk about three areas. There are multiple areas it is. One is the importance of local news. The second is the cyber threat, which we haven't talked about yet. And the other, picking up on Jess's last point, is around that individual responsibility and digital civility. And I think our view is that there is an unhealthy information ecosystem that we currently have, which is damaging our ability to protect democracy, to protect democratic institutions and processes, communities, and viable economic markets, to pick up on your point, Jess. So first on local news, people now have more access to information than they've pretty much ever had before. Technology is connecting people with information. It's connecting information to people. I remember when I used to commute to work, I live in Brighton, so I would go up to London sometimes on Thameslink or whatever it was. And for those who remember, the rail line was disastrous for years. But we never got information about what was going on from news sources. We got it from social media, and it was invaluable information. It allowed you to, in real time, work out what you're going to do. But it's not news, it's information. And, you know, the quality, curated, edited sources of high-quality journalism, of analysis and an opinion, empowered to seek the truth and to investigate and uncover hidden or obscure, and, you know, the kind of publish and be damned is hugely in demise. And local media it's incredibly important, not least for two things. Firstly, it builds societies. It creates a sense of community around a local media source. You know, we are really lucky in Brighton to have two local papers. And reading those papers every day, you actually get a sense of what the community is and what's important to that community. Without it, with the absence of that, if you're relying on information, you don't have any of that community building, that society building that is incredibly important. Not least that we've seen over the last 18 months, quite how important it is to be connected to each other. But the second is also to support democracy. Local news is perhaps the most powerful mechanism for holding local democratic institutions to account, to work out what are the decisions that my local authority is taking in my name? You know, what are the decisions of the magistrates' courts and the county courts? It's unless you've actually got a trusted source of local news, you are unable to hold these institutions to account. Research conducted in the US, but also broadly applicable, suggests that areas without a local news service are also correlated with lower voting rates, less community engagement, and increased borrowing by local government because they're not being held to account for what they're doing. So where do we go from here? We can't really roll the clock back, even if we wanted to. Local journalism, in many respects, fulfilled a need supported by an operational market. People bought papers. Businesses advertised in the paper in order to get their message out, and it kept the paper going. And the market no longer works. So this ubiquitous access to information makes a paid-for model really quite challenging. And the absence of ad revenue makes a free or subsidized model equally hard. Local media fulfilled this need, providing local news to local people who had no alternative means of finding it. Is media an anachronism, no longer fulfilling a need? I would say absolutely not, but the market is equally broken. I don't have solutions, but we do think having the debate, which is why we're here today, is absolutely necessary. And if something emerges that's workable, we want to get behind it. And by workable, we think there are some principles that I think are important here. The first is that news organizations should be paid a fair share of the money their work generates. That the value of news should probably be negotiated rather than defined by news platforms. Collective bargaining is probably a good idea, particularly for smaller news outlets, so that it doesn't lose out to the dominance of large platforms. Large platforms and media outlets. Final offer arbitration is probably the best model that we've seen to try to deliver a kind of equitable share for everybody. Non-retaliation by media platforms against, platforms against media, and transparency around algorithms that affect the way in which news is referred. Absolutely fundamental to getting this right. So that's the first bit, is local news, and the really fundamental role that local news plays in democracy. But the second is cyber attack. And what we're seeing is the emergence of nation-state-sponsored cyber threat against our democratic institutions in a way that is unprecedented in history. The number and sophistication of cyber attacks on our democratic institutions, on the Labour Party, I've seen in the last year, is shocking. On the Electoral Commission, on a variety of different organizations, this cyber threat is deeply worrying. And it's not malicious actors who are out for their own means. These are nation-state-sponsored cyber attacks, particularly from North Korea, from Russia, and from China. And we're also seeing now the rise of what are called private sector offensive actors. So these are, effectively private organizations who sell their cyber threat technology to the highest bidder. And we've recently seen this with the NSA group based out of Israel, and the Pegasus software that you may have seen installed on through various messaging platforms that allows them access to content. And now we're also seeing the intersection of COVID and the cyber threat, with these threat actors, specifically targeting healthcare organizations. The WHO has suffered from these organizations. So, there are a couple of things that we really need to do there, because this is our democracy that is at threat from these cyber attacks. One, we need to get much better at sharing threat information so that we can identify it fast. Two, we need to strengthen international rules about the behaviors of these threat actors, particularly constraining the activities of private sector offensive actors, so that they can't, as NSO Group did, claim that because of international law, they were, because their technology was being used by a government, that they were sheltered from prosecution. That's the kind of international action that can be taken to hold these to account. And then the third is that we hold nation states to account, such as much wider attribution of where nation states are actually sheltering these actors and sponsoring the act. So that's the second way in which we would agree that democracy is at risk. I'm conscious of time, so just the final point is, goes to Jess's point from a little bit earlier about individual responsibility, and particular digital civility. And we really feel very strongly, we've been tracking this since 2016 in an annual poll conducted now across 32 different countries, around where people feel the risks to themselves are coming from. And we poll children or younger people and adults across behavioral, sexual, reputation, and the kind of personal or intrusive threats. The problem that we've got with this research is that amongst the 32 countries that we poll, the UK is actually one of the most civil of all.
Wow.
And I think that's shocking for everyone, actually, because discourse online is so far from civil. But it's about individuals taking responsibility for their own online activities, for making sure that the discourse that they have online is civil and is respectful, and is supportive of democratic processes. And so that's the kind of third area that we think that there's more individual accountability that we'll need to take. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I wonder how the polling of left-wing Twitter would go down, but probably not very well, I fear. Great, so I'm going to open up now to you guys as the audience. So please do pop your hand up. I'll take groups of 3, and we've got a speaker at the back. So gentleman just here, the lady just here, and the gentleman at the back. And if you say your name and where you're from at the start, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you. My name's Stephen Kinsella. I'm a board member at Hacked Off, so I'm concerned about the journalism angle, but I'm also a founder of a campaign called Clean Up the Internet, which is looking to raise the level of discourse online, just as you were explaining. We hear a lot about the need for global cooperation on this. I think it's desirable, but I don't think it's essential, and certainly not if it means we're going to experience significant delay, because look at the UK digital market. It's such an important market that if we act and legislate here, the platforms will have to comply, and they probably won't be able to have a different business model for the rest of the world. So where we lead, I think they will have to follow anyway. So we should be bold. We've got the online safety bill coming through, but I'm concerned that we're really pulling our punches on that. I think there's a risk. This is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to legislate, and I don't see it going far enough, because the tendency seems to be to let the platforms set their terms and conditions and to audit themselves, and then give Ofcom some fairly light touch regulation of them. Now, I know Chi and Joe Stevens and others are pushing hard for this, but you know, this is a government that itself set up fake websites. So let's not be too confident that we can rely on them to build the trust that we need in this ecosystem. Thank you.
Thank you. And the lady just across from you.
Hi, my name's Bora. I'm a delegate from Hammersmith. And my background is actually in all of these areas. So I was a part of a startup team at a very successful news aggregator about 5 years ago. So we were dealing with all of this. Around the time that happened was the whole proliferation of fake news. And one thing I wanted to ask Chi was about the problem of the bar is very, very low for people in sort of elected public office who actually understand these issues. I remember at the time, I think it was Matt Hancock who was at DCMS, and he was being hailed as the sort of the tech expert within the government. And I would speak to, I was speaking to people, you know, sort of editorial staff at, you know, digital publications who were just shaking their head in horror because, you know, I watched select committee hearings and, you know, I know that elected politicians are obviously trying very hard, but the actual sort of civil servants who deal with this and so on, because there's an age gap, because senior people tend to be of an older generation who didn't grow up with this technology, when you hear them talking about TikTok or, you know, you can even hear from their voices that they don't understand. So I'm wondering how we can actually improve. We need to get sort of younger people and people who actually understand the language and, you know, and instinctively know what this is, because I think that information gap is also probably leading to the fact that a lot of our legislation is not fit for the pace of the innovation and the way the technology industry, and particularly in news, is moving.
Thank you. We've got Nadine Doris now, so I'll let you decide whether that's an improvement. Gentleman at the back.
Hi everyone, my name is Chris from Vauxhall. Thank you for this interesting session. My question is around trust in democracy and media, which we know is at an all-time low. So what does the panel think about initiatives such as fact-check in order to establish a more reliable source of information, and how we can cut through to the truth? Because so many people, like my auntie who is 70 years old, easily believe what's disseminated in WhatsApp, which is really easy to just spread around, like wildfire. Thank you.
Fantastic. So we've got a question about regulation and the degree to which the UK can be a leader. We've got a question on the level of understanding in politics. And we've got a question on role of fact checks. Chi, I'll start with you.
Well, I'll take the points and questions which order. I mean, I think, Stephen, you're obviously, not obviously, but I do think you're absolutely right that the UK can be a leader. And you should remember that the UK has been a leader. And indeed, most of, the European Union's communications regulation was based on UK regulation, which came out. And it's also, I think, really the case that, if we wait for a global regulator, someone said we'll be waiting forever. So we need to set out what, you know, we need to be bold, as you said, but, you know, with or without Nadine Dorries, but most certainly with Nadine Dorries, that is not what the online harms bill is going to be. And I think there's two really important things that Labour has to do here, and I mean Labour is a movement. We have to make sure that the government is held responsible and accountable for the 10 wasted years that they have presided over us being unsafe online. You know, they have done that. The supposed party of law and order have spent 10 years doing nothing so that we are now not safe online, regardless of what they're saying. And then at the same time, we have to, as you said, Stephen, push to make sure, you know, that the bill has key principles in it which will help safeguard people in the future. And there are trade-offs, you know, to be made around, discussions to be held around trade-offs between, if you like, sort of freedom of speech, or how freedom of speech needs to operate in a sort of digital age where digital reach is associated with freedom of speech. It's not the same thing, but I think we need to be raising those issues and making sure there's a debate about that, because otherwise I'm also concerned that the government is going to get away with doing this sort of very minimal, messy, it's incoherent, it's going to end up with lots of things added into it, and it doesn't define what harm is, you know, and they'll seem to have, you know, got online harms done like they supposedly got Brexit done. So I think we need to make sure, you know, an accountability for what they haven't done for the last 10 years, and in terms of getting at least the basic principles in play. Actually, in terms of politicians and technology, I mean, this may surprise you, but part of the, you know, politicians don't like to look stupid, you know. And part of the challenge with technology is that, you know, it is complicated, but there's many complex issues in policy, but it is seen as being complicated, and it's seen as being, you know, it's part of one of the issues that I want to challenge as Shadow Science Ministers. It's seen to being something that people can't readily understand, and that is that's an issue of communication, you know, as well as so politicians don't want to look stupid, so they don't want to talk about, you know, they don't want to talk about things when people are going to laugh at them for getting the tech wrong. But I think you're absolutely right to say that that's partially what the civil service is there for, isn't it? To make sure that, you know, politicians look more intelligent than they are. Yeah. So I think we do need. I think there are two big challenges. You know, there is the thing. You know, there is the fact that the civil service tends, you know, not to specialise. So an understanding of, you know, it's not specialties, it's generality. Understanding of technology is difficult to acquire. But there's also, you know, there's issue of funding and resources. I mean, DCMS has been cut, like every department has been cut. How can, you know, get people with the right skills? We did have a world-leading government digital service, which attracted people with the right skills into public service to do public good. Yeah, but then under the last sort of 5 years, that's been really sort of eviscerated. So I suppose I'm saying I think you're right, but I don't think we're going to see a challenge. We don't see a resolution to that, unfortunately, again under this government. But you know, we should attract more people into the service. And then just on, you know, on misinformation, you know, I was appalled when constituents in Newcastle told me that the vaccine had the number 666 in its DNA or something, and it was a sign that it was the devil's way of bringing about the apocalypse, and they found that over on WhatsApp. Yeah, and so but my concern when you have things with fact check is that you have these global companies like Facebook making huge amounts of money and not paying taxes, and then you get public sector organizations or NGOs checking their facts for them, you know. So whilst I do agree, I do think, you know, that, you know, and I think the points Jess was making about we need to have methods, processes in place of ensuring trusted news. We also need to have the responsibility with the platforms have a responsibility for the harm that the misinformation they spread does. That is a responsibility. It's a liability. They also need to sort it out as well.
Fantastic. Jessica.
I think I can probably best address my remarks to the last point about fact-checking. Fact-checking is fantastic, in my view. I think what's really interesting is that over the last couple of years, as the evident disinformation is so dangerous, you've got a situation where you obviously have, as you always have had, news organisations you can trust, and their editorial standards mean you can trust it. So that's kind of one layer. But you've also got some really interesting ways in which news organisations around the world now see it as their responsibility to help their audiences, their users, to navigate a really complicated information environment, even if it is news or near news or disinformation that's outside what they've actually published. And fact-checking is part of that. So I think it's hugely to be welcomed. You've got a situation, for instance, and I think AFP was one of the first leaders in doing that, which is they noticed that during the Gilets jaunes protests, a lot of people in France were actually talking amongst themselves in big Facebook groups, but they were actually coming to AFP to ask whether what they heard was true or not. So in a sense, that kind of set the template of fact-checking being slightly apart from being a conventional news provider. As she said, you know, sometimes you've got, for instance, Facebook pays for some fact-checkers. You've got fact-checking within news organisations. The BBC has Reality Check. There are many others. And there are brilliant organisations like Full Fact, which are great. But I think they're part of this kind of new environment, which is hugely to be welcomed. But it is new, and it's new because it is reacting to an entirely different situation in which we find ourselves.
Hugh.
I'm going to try and answer Stephen and Chris in the same way. I think there is an opportunity for leadership. If you think about what GDPR did, like it or loathe it, and it has provided all sorts of complexities for, constituency MPs handing casework over from one person to another, for example. There are a variety of different ways in which it's complex. But it has defined the rules by which everywhere now operates. And so it's interesting that now we're looking at the UK government deciding to go its own route and thinking, well, the bar's already up there. What's the point in lowering the bar in one market? Because it's not going to lower it anyway. So I think there is an opportunity. But I think the challenge is and it's a very real challenge of how you address this. So how do you get the balance right? Because in some respects, it's about who takes accountability for Donald Trump's tweets. Is it the platform that allows misinformation to be carried, or is it an individual, or is it, you know, how do we work our way through that? And we haven't talked. Encryption is another example. It's really hard. So we have the Information Commissioner's Office concerned about privacy and requiring more platforms to introduce higher levels of encryption, particularly end-to-end encryption, in order to protect the privacy of individuals and their private communications. While at the same time, the Home Office is encouraging us not to go down that route and to have less. So, you know, the debate is really taking place within the organizations that should know about this and actually can't reach a decision about which way to go and who is going to take accountability and who's going to make these decisions. Should it be a platform making a decision, or should it be the government, or, you know, do we really want the individual platforms to have more power to make decisions about what can or can't be carried? But then on the other hand, do we also want other governments to have more power about what? And so it's a really difficult one. And so, you know, to Bora's point, the reason why so many of these organizations and you know, the potential regulators that we've got in this space are Ofcom, ICO, Competition and Markets Authority, and there will be more as well. Exactly. So there are a number of these. And to your point, you know, we are not convinced that so at ministerial level, I think we accept that there is a low level of understanding of this. But are these organizations sufficiently equipped to be able to navigate our way through this? And I agree with Chi. There's a sort of learned helplessness in many respects, because a lot of it is not complicated. It just feels way too much. And actually, we're dealing, in many respects, not with technology. We're dealing with ethical, moral issues about how we want to interact in a society with technology. How do we want to use it? And that's not about the way technology operates. It's about how do we define rules that we want to, that a settled governance between society and technology. There's a principle that we try to operate within Microsoft, which is called a growth mindset, which is this idea that you don't have the answers and that you seek to understand more and you're always learning. I do think that kind of principle within parts of the kind of body politic more broadly would also be extremely helpful, because it would encourage this inquisitiveness to find out a little bit more about some of these issues underneath.
Just before, I'm going to come up for questions in a minute, so start thinking of your questions. I just wanted to ask very briefly, Jessica, whether you feel optimistic about global cooperation, because in lots of areas of public life, and we've got COP coming up as the latest test of it, we're not feeling that optimistic about global cooperation. Do you think there's a potential on this issue?
Absolutely, I do, because I think supporting democracy is too important not to. I think it's about precision on very specific things. It's not about kind of big, woolly, big tents, but it's about really specific things. And I think I do, because I think there's no alternative.
Fantastic. We'll take a round of questions. So who would like to come in at this point? So we've got the gentleman on the left here, the lady at the back in the very nice yellow coat, and the gentleman just here.
My name's Peter, and I'm a Labour Party member. The common theme that you all mentioned was this need for individual responsibility, either the corporation or the individual making some remark or doing something. And it struck me that the reason we're civil to each other, at least in part in ordinary life, is the fact that we're known and identifiable. And that brought me back to things that Hugh was saying about signatures. She mentioned deep fakes, I think, and false news. So considering that the best software engineers in the world probably work for these cloud companies like Microsoft and the Twitters and the Facebooks and all the rest of it, improving something about the way I can authenticate my posts with my digital signature, so it just makes it extraordinarily difficult for anybody else to misrepresent me, like you were saying about the BBC, and I can easily recognise who's seeing. I might not know their address, but I know them because that's that signature, and something like that. That was it.
My question is, what do you see any kind of positive point about technology to promote democracy? For example, the Russian descendants used Telegram to organize themselves. Obviously, weeks ago, the Telegram kind of they give out their details eventually, but for years, descendants in all over the globe managed to use encrypted messages to communicate with each other. Like in Hong Kong, in Myanmar, etc. So do you see any positive point of technology?
Great, and then just the gentleman just here.
Hi, my name is Chris. I'm here from Buckingham Constituency Party. Again, on personal responsibility, I believe the Finnish government has a great public awareness, and I think the last 18 months, people have learnt a lot. We've seen that the public can understand quite complex things around the COVID pandemic and change their mindsets and learn and adapt. Should we not be looking at sort of public education, starting potentially from schools, and rolling that out and being a wider communications platform so that people actually learn about how to keep themselves safe online, how to understand where fake news might come from? Because people that work in tech, people who have a background, people who do this instinctively know, as has been said several times, it's not difficult. It's just a case of people think it's difficult. So is there something more we should be doing on that level?
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And I'm going to abuse my position of chair to ask a fourth, which is about Facebook's oversight board and the degree to which we are hopeful or concerned about that, and what the alternatives might be for kind of new forms of regulation. So we've got 4 questions. Can we make people known and identifiable on the web? The positive potential of technology, and personal responsibility, and then Facebook's oversight board. Chi, you're still typing. Shall I come to you in a second?
Oh,
I'm happy to go if you want. See, Chi, okay, so Peter, I think your question
I
is
just came through first last time.
super interesting, super interesting. We have rejected ID cards. And so, and that's as a principle. So requiring people to authenticate online when we don't authenticate offline, we have no offline kind of verifiable identity, is really hard. And again, I think it's less about the technology, because I think the technology can do this. So Xbox, we make a lot of effort to make sure that people are not identifiable on Xbox, because that's a privacy concern. But a credit card is used for various kind of verification purposes. We have two-factor authentication on your Microsoft account, those kind of things. So we're making efforts to try and make sure that is the case. But a credit card can be bought for as little as £15 on the web. And so if people are really determined, then they can do this quite easily. And so again, it's not a technology issue. It's a moral, ethical issue about how do we think about identity in the world in which we're living. And I think that's something that is very much up for debate. And if the UK decides that it does want to go down the route of identity, then that's a relatively easy thing to do, to transpose that into the digital environment. The question about the positive impact of technology, I think I may have come across as being overly negative. I'm a fan of technology. I think the way in which it connects people with ideas, and it empowers people who would otherwise be voiceless, and connects communities together, is incredibly powerful, as a means of organizing, as a means of I mean, I think the story that Twitter and Facebook used to justify or to back up a lot of their positions was the use of social media for the what was it called? The big changes across the Middle East, including Egypt,
Arab Spring.
With the Arab Spring, which actually didn't turn into, it didn't fulfill the promise of it. But again, it was the mechanism by which people associated and organized, which then relied on an anonymity online. And so you've kind of got this, again, this problem about identity online and anonymity. And if social media can be used for a positive effect of democracy, then do you need to preserve the anonymity online rather than... So really, Chris, on schools, I mean, my only worry is that we put so much on the shoulders of teachers already that I do think that there is... But it seems to be an obvious place in which you have a lot of interaction, and it's also necessary. I think parents also shoulder something. We teach our children to cross a road safely, and actually, if we can try and inculcate this idea that in the same way that we teach our children to be safe on the road, that we teach them to be safe online, but then we provide the necessary means of doing so. And there's a lot of work that's taking place on that. I mean, we have our own kind of materials and information that we provide. But again, if we can collaborate a little bit more on this kind of thing rather than compete on it, then I think we can make some more progress. I'm not going to comment on your question. I think it's unfair of me to make a comment on someone who's not here from one platform to another, if that's okay.
Absolutely fine. Jessica, over to you.
I'm not sure I've got a lot to add on the point about, you're absolutely right, Peter. Of course, the more we all have to take our own responsibility, but whether you can authenticate, and indeed when you look at the way in which Telegram supports democracy around the world, whether you want to, is a really, really difficult question. I'm not sure I've got an awful lot to add on that. But I am a huge optimist about technology, and I think if you look at Navalny at the moment in Russia and his anti-corruption drive, that absolutely happens because of social media and what it can do, and that is fantastically important, and we would know nothing about it otherwise. And so the nature of what we're talking about is because social media is post-moderated. In other words, you put it up and then somebody works out what to do about it. And that's what allows us to know about things that people don't want you to know about. Myanmar is also another really recent example where incredibly important voices for democracy wouldn't otherwise be heard. Chris, absolutely, completely. You know, we should be cooperating on media education for children, but I think the point I was trying to make is that you've got to think very differently about what you say to children and how you build critical thinking into what they do, parents do, schools do, and you make an extension of the kind of critical thinking that we teach children anyway. You've also got to think in an entirely different way about older audiences who come across disinformation with a whole lot of baggage about who to trust and who not to trust. And they're kind of different kind of problems. So I think as well as having a roadmap that doesn't have various resources competing against each other, we also need to think about the needs of very, very particular groups in very different ways. So you've got some really interesting, for older people, there's an organisation called Maldita in Spain, which is looking at crowdsourcing tips on WhatsApp of disinformation and sharing the learnings with people and trying to use a kind of much more peer-to-peer model. But obviously that's entirely different from what you're talking about with young children. So huge amounts of thought needs to be done on that. The Facebook Oversight Board, it's a work in progress. Let's see where we get to. I mean, clearly its remit is being talked about at the moment. You know, and it deals with one platform, and clearly what I've been talking about is actually cooperation across platforms as well. But anything that looks at the settled governance between technology and society, you know, the more discussion about that, the better.
Yeah. I was really impressed actually listening to Nick Clegg recently about him, saying it was a positive step forward, but they'd rather it be regulated across platforms. You know, they don't want to have to do it themselves for lots of reasons. So interesting to see where that goes. Chi, over to you.
Great. Well, I think it's really important that we talk about identity, and so I'm going to. I think that addresses two of the questions raised. But Peter, I thought when you were asking about an easily recognised signature, was that for individuals or was that for organisations like the BBC or for both? Because I think verifying content it's both of those questions, and I know that, for example, Adobe, so Twitter has its tick for the BBC, etc. Others, there's the potential for legislation so that to criminalise sort of faking organisations, and that we have that with websites, etc. And I know that Adobe is working on a ways of sort of a digital signature on photographs, etc., to show whether or not they have been faked. So I think there are sort of ways in which technology can help when it comes to organisations. I think the fundamental question, though, of identity and identifying people online, is something that's at the heart of some of the sort of moral and value questions that we face around digital. And I'd say, Hugh, that whilst I agree with you that there are trade-offs to be made and to thought about, but I don't think that we have. We do have forms of identity offline. We have a range of identity forms. We don't have a national identity card. But we have, you know, we have credit cards, we have passports, we have, if you want to open a bank account, my gosh, you need to have a lot of identity. If you want to order something over Uber Eats or something, you need a credit card. If you want to start have a, you know, there's a spectrum of ID, and so I believe that's what we should be looking at online as well, because I think the right to anonymity is really important, and it's important when we talk about the Arab Spring, and when we talk about those who you know, who want to express themselves online, but who, because of their sexual orientation or because of their religion or for whatever reason, might not want to be identified. It's important to retain that right, but it's also important that not necessarily doesn't mean that you then have a right to be in everybody's Twitter stream or Facebook stream. I should have the right to also to be able to choose whether or not I see anonymous posts, for example. And also, you know, we need a right to have an online identity. And again, and this is where there was an initiative for online identity, Verify, but the government messed it up for a number of reasons. But one very important reason, and I think this is because you know, technology is not political in a way, but the way in which we use technology and implement it is, the government wanted it to be entirely free market. So Experian, others were going to verify your identity for you. And it ended up not work. It didn't work for a number of reasons, but including the ones that, you know, there weren't really incentives for private sector operators to come into an identity market that wasn't set up. And also people, including myself, I want my identity verified by the public sector. I don't want to have a credit rating to have my identity verified. Thank you very much. So, you know, this is where, again, where ideology has put us in, you know, particularly free market ideology has put us in a more a backward place to which we would otherwise be. So I think we need to be able to offer people the right to have an identity. That is not the same as the requirement to have an identity online. And I do think that can be done in technology terms, as long as people don't make it a question of free market ideology. And so, yeah, you know, I said technology, I think, is an engine of progress, and it can be an engine of political progress. And we saw that during the Arab Spring. I do want to issue a word of sort of warning, though, because, and this comes to the other point about digital literacy, those who are offline do not get the benefits. And let us remember that 10% of people in this country are still offline. And one of the, here I go again, if you like, one of the critical failings of this government has been to abandon any kind of digital inclusion strategy. And to have digital literacy, you need to have digital inclusion. And digital inclusion, you know, it goes, you know, is again, it's a journey. You start by getting online, and then you can move up this sort of the skills level. And so, not having a digital inclusion strategy, not having ways, you know, I agree that you know, it's obviously partially it is parental responsibility. It can be done at schools, but it should also be done as seen as something that is a requirement of being a digital citizen. And we're all digital citizens, is to be able to negotiate the digital world, and people need to be supported and helped to do that. And unfortunately, that's not happening. And so, so yes, you know, it is something that I think that, you know, I know the point that was made that schools do an awful lot of things already, but you know, this is like, you know, being able to tick a box. This is like basic literacy. This is like, you know, being able to vote. So I think that's really important. And then just finally, you know, Facebook Oversight Board. Well, I'll say this, I was recently written to by somebody acting on behalf of the Facebook Oversight Board, who asked me if I was willing to do a research interview to share my expertise and understanding of these issues with the Facebook Oversight Board. And I will say to you that I gave them what was not a very pleasant response. Because, you know, firstly, Mark Zuckerberg had the opportunity to come before our digital select committee and find out the views of Parliament on Facebook, and he refused that, and he still is refusing that. So, you know, the oversight of Facebook is not simply a matter for Facebook Oversight Board. Secondly, as I've said, you know, I don't believe in self-regulation is working, and Facebook can't, and shouldn't only be accountable to themselves. And I'd also add, with regard to Nick Clegg, he was the Deputy Prime Minister when the sort of foundations for our current mess were laid. So in terms of what he's doing now to oversee Facebook making progress when it comes to some of these difficult and challenging issues, I think he has a responsibility for them, and I don't think Facebook is the right place to resolve them.
Fantastic. I'm going to take one more round of questions and then we're going to wrap up. So this is your last chance to question our amazing panel. Gentlemen just here. Anybody else want to come in at this point? Gentleman behind. Yeah, got two questions.
In 2016, there was a census in Australia that was done online, and it just caused a complete collapse of government websites. And then we've seen more recently in the US the attack on the voting machines. Is this the end of the digitization of democracy around the world?
Great question. Yes, cool.
Thank you. I mentioned our campaign, Clean Up the Internet, and one of the proposals we're making at the moment is responding to Peter's point, really, which is to say, yes, we don't believe in compelling people to be identified, but everyone should be allowed to be verified if they want to, and the platform should enable that verification in a safe and secure way. And there are good solutions out there that don't involve us giving our data to the platforms that they can then monetize and target us with further ads. But the advantage of that would be that those who were verified, so let's say we'd all have a tick, you could then see who was verified, and our proposal is you should be able then to choose to say, I choose not to interact with people who have not gone to the problem of verifying themselves. That's their free choice. They'll still be able to express their views. I may not see them.
Fantastic. Anybody else before we wrap up? Over to the panel. I'm going to come to you last, G. Is that okay? We'll start on this side.
Yeah, okay, just that second one. I don't know if you talked to any of the social media platforms about it, but... We try. Yeah, I mean, I can't really... We don't... The social media platform we operate is one where everyone is desperate to identify. It's LinkedIn. And so we don't have the same kind of problem. But I do think that it's an interesting idea that you could actually, to Chi's point earlier about the Twitter tick. I think it's a really interesting idea, one that I think I could, it's good luck with the conversations that you're going to have on that. I have my own conversations on that as well. But I think that's right. It's the right to provide identity rather than the requirement for identity. The end of digitization of democracy. I look back at some of our recent elections, and I kind of really am thankful that quite so much of it is analog. Particularly when we were talking a little earlier about the cyber threat to democratic institutions, and what the potential for that really opens up. So I think there are bits that could be parts of the process that could be digitized. I do think that we need to be really clear about how far we're prepared to go on that in an environment where, again, come back to my point, that our democracy is under more and more threat in an online environment.
I'll tell you one bit, sorry, I will come to you next, Jessica, but the one bit that I think we really need to get to grips with digitally is Parliament, and the fact that there was this whole debate during COVID about whether people could contribute to parliamentary debate without being in there, and I'm thinking of parents as well. It's just unbelievably ridiculous that we still haven't managed to get to grips. Or vote, indeed, yeah, exactly, or vote, exactly. It's unbelievable.
Or people who were sheltering because of illness or for a whole variety of reasons. Yeah. I think that's exactly right.
You've got parents there with a vote at 9, 10 o'clock in the evening, and their kids are running around. It's just a joke, isn't it? Jessica, over to you.
Have we come to the end of digitising democracy? Well, clearly we haven't, just as we've discussed, but I think we do have to ask ourselves, where would making democratic processes more digital create a vulnerability, because there are an awful lot of bad actors there, and almost before we do anything in increasing the digital presence in democracy, we have to ask ourselves that question, because I think what's extraordinary, as we've heard, is the ingenuity of bad state actors out there, and ignore that at your peril. So that's a framework for thinking about where it can go, where it can't go. Allowing ourselves to be identified, I think that's a really interesting framework, actually. I mean, I hadn't quite thought about it like that. I think it's fascinating. I'm not sure I've got an awful lot to add. Just to pick up one point that Chi was making, which is really interesting, which is that we, organisations, are looking at the verification of media. Obviously, it's a slightly different thing, but the idea that there is, and Microsoft, BBC and various others are working on this, that you have a so-called fragile watermark that you put on media as it leaves the originating organisation. And then when it comes to being published online, you can work out whether that watermark has been tampered with. And in a sense, that's the methodology to deal with deepfakes, because you can't look at a deepfake and say it is a deepfake. That's impossible. What you can do is look at its provenance. But what that relies on is international standards, international cooperation, and broad adoption. These are complicated, difficult, precision engineering works, but I think that's what we need to do.
Were you signaling you want to comment?
I just wanted to come in on a point that Jess made, which I think is so valuable, which is this: how do we think about the consequences of technology adoption at the point at which we're developing the technology, rather than as a retrofit?
Yeah.
And I think, if you go back to the Luddites, okay, so and this is not meant to be a history lesson, but you go back to the Luddite movement. I mean, there was never any sense that those who were responsible for developing technology that mechanized the looms had any responsibility for the consequences of the adoption of that technology. But then we move forward to the internal combustion engine, and you're beginning to see things like retrofitting, but not too far. I mean, the introduction of safety features, for example, and seat belts and things like that. Then we get to where we are with social media, and I think though there are negative consequences of social media, but were not necessarily envisaged at the time in which social media was developed. But I think the point we're at now is with nascent and developing artificial intelligence. We as a society, I think, have an opportunity to think much more carefully about what the consequences of some of the developments of technologies will actually look like, and to spend a considerable, whether or not the Facebook Oversight Committee operates effectively or not, actually the attempt to try to understand what could the consequence of a technology adoption be before it's actually widely adopted, and try to solve for that at the point at which it's being developed, I think is hugely welcome and very, very positive.
Gee, over to you to wrap up today's conversation.
And just on that last point, which is about ethics and engineering. And one of the things, I studied at Imperial War a long time ago now, 25 years ago, something like that. But I think that it's really important that we recognise that there is an ethical dimension to engineering. There's an ethical dimension to technology implementation, and engineers need to be aware of that. And I think that is you described very well, Hugh, the kind of the evolution of the role of technology in our lives, from sort of automating looms to now being something that I have 3 digital devices just myself. So given the role engineering and technology plays in all our lives, it's right that there should be the ethical dimension should be recognized. And just as doctors sort of take a vow to do no harm, engineers should at least think about the harm that they may be enabling. But so this has been fantastic questions again. again. And Stephen, I think you and I agree. I agree that that there should be a right to identity, and you should be able to exclude those who do not want to identify themselves. When it comes to the end of the digitization of democracy, I think the short answer is no, because I think it will be tried. It will be tried and trying, and improve in a way. But I as I sort of said, technology isn't something that happens to us. We shape it. And the challenge here, I think, is that some of these sort of digitizations, are seen as short-term not short-term, but ways in which either to reduce costs or effectively to reduce costs either by cutting the costs or by accessing more people for less costs. And whereas really there needs to be, and this is about the design framework, it needs to be sort of understood, really understood what the best way of engaging with people through digital is. The issue of cybersecurity, though, is huge. And that is, whilst we are as vulnerable as many systems are in terms of cyber, in cyber terms, I mean, like our critical national democratic infrastructure should need to be protected from the potential of a cyber attack. But I also just would like to say on this that we are seeing public services being digitized all the time, and they're being digitized incrementally, and they're almost always being digitized to save money, not to enable and empower people. And that, for me, that is a form of anti-democratic digitization. As long as we have digital exclusion, if you're digitizing democratic or public services without having everybody included, then you're going back effectively to a form of like rotten boroughs in 19th century democracy. And I think, that is unacceptable. And just finally then on digital parliament, because I led the campaign to digitize parliament back in, I forget, actually, I know, it was just after lockdown. In fact, it was the last day of parliament before lockdown. And again, this sort of shows in some ways the intersection of ideology and technology, because everyone sort of thought that there would be it was really, actually, to be honest, it was really difficult, and people thought that the barrier would be the sort of Hansard or the Erskine May or the people working in Parliament, or actually all those problems were solved. I mean, it took lots of meetings, lots of discussions. We looked at what happened in Brazil and other countries, looked at technologies. All those problems were solved. The issue, actually, and the reason why we're no longer doing it is because the leader of the House, Jacob Rees-Mogg, wants things physical, basically. And, he was obliged to enable it to be digital, or what we call hybrid, for a while, partially because there are MPs who could not, leave the home.
Inside, Robert Halfon was very vocal
about it. Yes, but the sort of and the reason why we went back on 6 September to a fully physical Parliament is to send a message that the pandemic was over and we should be getting back to normal. So, again and again, technology, I think the understanding of technology is really important, but technology is actually not the biggest issue. The biggest issue is the politics and the values that shape how it's used.
It's cultural.
Fantastic. Well, I set us an ambition at the start of the session to have a nuanced, practical debate about this, and I think we've thoroughly lived up to that, and that's thanks, first of all, to our panellists, to Chi, to Jessica, and to Hugh, and, of course, to you as the audience. So thank you for your time today. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.